Well, hello there, and welcome to what is the 154th edition of DF Direct Weekly, which, as usual, is our weekly discussion show discussing the latest gaming and technology news. Not a huge amount of gigaton news this week, but still much to discuss. Joining me first of all, Oliver Mackenzie.
Hey, Rich, always a pleasure to be up at this late hour on a DF Direct with you two.
And, of course, Alex Battaglia.
Yeah, you can't ever forget that. For Oliver, he's about to go to bed. And for us, we just woke up. So it's amazing that we can even do this.
Kind of strange stuff. Mm-hmm. Before we crack on with the news stories, we've got some news of our own. Basically, our merchandising store at store.digitalfoundry.net has been updated. Will has sent me a big bunch of news topics to discuss there. Basically, first of all, our motherboards t-shirt, which I'm modelling here. I'll try and hove that into view there. That is now available. The DF approved t-shirt, which I think I'm wearing Alex, you're wearing there.
Yeah, it's looking good.
Which I'm assured by our legal people will not result in a legal case from Nintendo. That is now available. The DF Fighters shirt, that is also available now, having been restocked. That one sold out pretty quickly first time around, so I guess get them while they're hot or indeed available. We've also reduced some shipping costs because some of those were being weirdly calculated when we first launched the store. So those have now been sorted. And yeah, that's basically a nice way to support Digital Foundry if you enjoy what we do and want to basically walk around advertising Digital Foundry, which is, what can I say? It's a fantastic way to exist.
And also, these t-shirts, in the eventuality that we do in-person meetups, we're going to get the t-shirt cannon and we're going to blast you all in the audience with a variety of these t-shirts.
So, Trump style.
Trump style. You're going to shout Wendy's, as John told us, and we're just going to absolutely hammer you with a t-shirt.
Okay, yes, so that is our commercial for ourselves out of the way, so let's move on to our first news topic. Okay, so the next big PlayStation 5 game to arrive is going to be Rise of the Ronin from Team Ninja. I think Sony's publishing this one, and it is PlayStation 5 exclusive. The review embargo isn't quite up yet, but there is a limited preview embargo that has lifted. Which means that, Oliver, you've taken a quick look at this. You're not going to be covering the review, but you've taken a quick look at this one. And I'm curious as to your thoughts.
Yes, so for the purposes of this preview, I can talk about my experiences, but I have to show you the provided B-roll. So I can't go into detail and show the examples I'd like to show, but I can give you my impressions. So overall, I think that the takeaway for me is the game looks fine. Visually, there are a few interesting upgrades over Wolong. Games like Wolong, games like Stranger of Paradise, Final Fantasy Origin, if you remember that. The most interesting thing here is they have some kind of, it looks like a VSM style solution. So there's variable penumbra on the shadows. They appear very high resolution. I did see a little bit of shadow aliasing, but they look very, very high resolution, very pristine shadows with some super soft shadow edges as they fall away. Really nice looking on the foliage in particular, I think. That looks really nice. And those are present in all the modes. There's a performance mode, a graphics mode, and a ray tracing mode. And they're in all the modes. And on top of that, the RT mode, the ray tracing mode, has RT reflections on smaller bodies of water. So on the ocean, no. But on ponds, things like streams, you get RT reflections. They look quite good, I think. So those are two big upgrades over prior, like Katana Engine games, prior Team Ninja games that are pretty big upgrades, I think. They look quite good. The world itself is pretty dense, quite good looking. There's some really great looking foliage, nice foliage animation everywhere. Like the screen looks super busy and dense when you're in those more naturalistic environments. And in the open plains, the game looks great. In the cities, not quite as much. In the interior spaces, not quite as much. They still don't have really good GI solution, and the indirect lighting is just not that hot. There's AO and stuff, but it doesn't look that great there. So the lighting sort of falls apart there. Image quality is fine, although to me it looks like there's some sort of checkerboarding or some other similar upsampling solution. There's a lot of breakup in the foliage in particular. There's some aliasing artifacts in the motion blur, in like the post-processing effects. So far, it sounds okay, and I think relative to prior Team Ninja games, this is an upgrade. Like, it does look quite a lot better. To me, the real problem is performance. So in the performance mode, we're usually between 50 and 60 frames per second, sometimes 60. but often in that middle ground range. Cutscenes are at 30 there. In the graphics mode, the game runs in the 40s usually, but it has some really weird camera animation issues that I think you noticed as well, Alex.
Yeah, it looks like, based upon the footage I saw, it seems like the entire game's motion, sometimes it's like just camera motion in a game where like you spin the camera and the characters animate normally, but the camera moves at odd intervals per frame with linear motion. So one frame moves like twice the distance as the next. But here it looks like almost all of the game's animating elements move at different time rates per frame, which doesn't look right at all. And it makes it look like the game has a variable frame rate, even when it might technically, where it has nothing to do with the frame rate, essentially. It's very odd looking.
Yeah.
So you mean the simulation is updating at a different pace to the actual renderer?
Yeah, that's what it looks like. Yeah, I guess that's a good way to put it, actually. A very good way to put it.
Yeah. So that's a little iffy, but you can cap the graphics mode to 30 FPS, but then you get incorrect frame pacing, right? So 16, 50 millisecond, 33 millisecond frames sprinkled in there. The ray tracing mode actually, interestingly, hits 60 most of the time, more of the time probably than the performance mode, weirdly. It's like in that same ballpark at least. Has some dips to the 50s. You can cap it at 30 and it has the same frame pacing problems. You cannot cap the performance mode to 30 though. That is only at 60. The cap is disabled in that mode.
Okay, so how does the ray tracing mode, there's a graphics mode and a ray tracing mode, or the ray tracing is part of the graphics mode?
There's a ray tracing mode and a graphics mode and a performance mode.
Okay, right. Wow, that's a lot of permutations. What about the actual game itself, based on impressions within the embargo guidelines?
It's really fun. It's really, I think there's a certain elegance to it. It's a little bit Souls-like. It feels a lot like Neo, I would say. It's sort of striking that middle ground between a more traditional action game and a Souls-like game. The punishments for restarts are not severe. There's no punishments there. It's just a checkpoint system, for instance. Good. So it feels very good. It's very kind of parry-oriented, counterattack oriented. It's got a real timing to it, a real flow. Team Ninjas are like masters of this kind of thing. I think they do really terrific action games. So I think that's really terrific. And then the animation feels great. The like various bits of blood and gore that fly across on screen are very satisfying. And overall, yeah, I think the graphics are like, for a Team Ninja game, it looks totally fine for the most part. If you come into it with the expectation that you're getting a decent looking PS4 game level of visual fidelity overall, not to be too harsh, but that's kind of the level that you're at, plus ray tracing in the ray tracing mode, obviously, and plus the nice shadows, of course. But yeah, overall, it's really just the performance that I'm concerned with at this stage, at this preview stage, of course. Okay,
so sorry, earlier Alex was giving a pretty harsh critique and I was laughing. The reason why is that I'm looking at your footage, Oliver, which I believe is still under embargo, and therefore you might have to cut out the following comment. But you seem to be fighting somebody called Matthew Perry.
Yeah, you know,
I actually looked that up.
A very famous person. Yeah,
that struck me as well. I think that is not under embargo. We could talk about that. But okay, Matthew Perry was a historical English swashbuckler of some variety, in addition to an part of the actor.
Yeah, went to Japan.
So this is my own historical ignorance coming into play here. Not
yes,
it was mine too. I had to look it up.
Rest in peace, Matthew Perry, of all varieties of Matthew Perry.
It was somewhat incongruous when I said.
Oh, he was sorry.
It all makes perfect sense now.
He was an American naval officer who commanded ships in the War of 1812 and he was in the Perry expedition that ended Japan's isolationism, so it says on his website.
Okay, it all makes sense now. Except you seem to be wanting to kill him for some reason.
He's tough. He's tough.
Oh boy. There could be a lot of really bad jokes here, but we're just going to leave it.
I like Matthew Perry. What can I say? Okay, so there's not too much we can actually discuss at the moment. Any sort of final takeaways? I guess it's all going to be down to Tom when he takes a look at this, because there's quite a lot to get through, right? But it seems to me that probably RT and the performance modes are the way to go. I guess the RT mode is probably operating at a lower resolution than performance if it's actually performing faster in a lot of instances. But yeah, certainly looks intriguing. I don't really have an issue with the look of the game as such. Because yes, you were getting these type of visuals on the PlayStation 4 era, but you weren't getting them targeting 60 frames per second. right? So, I'm perfectly okay with that. And it is fundamentally about the gameplay at the end of the day, which, you seem quite happy about.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting element to this too, where obviously we've seen some issues recently with the scale and scope of AAA games. And I think that the game, looking the way it does, probably contributes to it having been, it seems like, developed in a reasonably brisk amount of time. So I think this is perfectly fine, given that it's their engine. They know what they're doing. They can iterate games on it. Obviously, they have great systems there. The only issue with these games, really, for me, has always been the performance. The performance was an issue in Wolong, issue in Stranger of Paradise, issue in Neo, I believe, as well. Yeah, there's some problems here, and I'm not totally sure what to chalk it up to, because there are some strange problems. But yeah, I would hope that those would be improved at some point around the launch period. That's my only wish there.
Any notes on the open world? This is apparently the first Team Ninja open world game.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get to explore too much of the open world. It is definitely an open world game. It does seem segmented a little bit more, but it feels pretty good to play. It's not for lack of direction. It's a fairly directed experience from what I can see so far. So it's not like too open worldy in my experience. That can be a bad thing. But yeah, it feels like a pretty confident take on it if you enjoy these kinds of Team Ninja action games.
Which many people do, including us. So good stuff. Okay. Yes, full review of that coming as and when the embargo lifts and as and when the work we do on it is complete. But until then, let's move on to the next news topic. So yesterday, just at the end of collating all of the news items for this week's Direct, we actually got a big bunch of GeForce announcements from Nvidia for GDC, which is coming up very, very soon now. And they're looking quite exciting, I think. Some big titles getting some big features. Alex, where do we want to begin with this? Should we begin with the low-key one first, which is the upgrade to Portal RTX?
Oh, yeah, that one has already been released. I have yet to... it's already downloaded on my machine, but I haven't loaded it up yet. But this one...
we actually saw this at Gamescom, didn't we?
We did. It was with the work-in-progress version of DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction. And here they've also added an RTX IO, which for a game like Portal, as I showed with, what's the name of the Portal Prelude, right? Is the name of the other one, where RTX IO is kind of like direct storage, but because Portal Prelude and Portal RTX run on Vulkan, I don't think direct storage actually works directly with Vulkan. And since there hasn't been a codified standard there, the IHVs have to roll their own subsystem there, and I think that's what RTX IO is. I don't actually think there is any sort of great functional difference with it and direct storage. But for a game like this, unlike Ratchet and Clank or some other more modern game, all the loading is done, I would say, like as the level starts, and it's brought mainly from there into system RAM or VRAM. And at that point in time, that's when RTX IO kicks in. So here in this case, what it tends to do is make the load a little bit quicker, and the amount of time it takes for the highest resolution bitmaps to load in and be visible is also dramatically reduced. And it doesn't seem to affect performance while that is happening at all either, which is a great thing to see. So that is cool. I think ray reconstruction in a game like this, Portal RTX by default, I'm pretty sure uses in its very high quality mode like 4 bounces, which is pretty intense.
Yes.
So in this case,
that was configurable though.
That was configurable. You could drop it down to high to bring it down to like 2, and most of the Portal artwork still held up well under 2 real bounces of diffuse and specular lighting. So it looked pretty well, but what this will mainly do is just make it for those instances where like the denoiser is having trouble stabilizing the image due to a low amount of light being visible. So it has like grain, and it's trying to make coherent looking images at the same time while they're moving. You can see this in some games where when you go from a low light area, a bright area to a low light area, you can see kind of like if you ever seen like fuzzy spots on the wall that keep constantly moving. This to try and stabilize that light for that. And that's what I saw basically in the preview images so far, but I have yet to load it up myself. That's the low-key one. It's also going to be coming to RTX Remix at some point in time, which should definitely help RTX Remix out quite a bit, because one of the best parts about ray reconstruction in DLSS 3.5 is that it is usually cheaper than the normal multiple kind of passes that are done for denoising. There's usually like a pass for denoising that's done for like direct lighting. There's usually one for indirect lighting. There could be other denoisers if there's more effects. For example, like caustics can maybe even have their own denoiser. And in this case, it's just a single denoiser taking care of all of the input signals in one pass while also doing upscaling at the same time. So it preserves a lot of the performance while honestly also looking better, which is pretty cool. And in this case, there's been a lot of comments online about RTX Remix bringing down an RTX 4090 to the knees, which I think is reasonable because it's path tracing being hacked into old games. But this should help performance there to some current unknown degree, but it's definitely going to be faster than the Nvidia NRD, as it's called. I forget, it's like ray tracing denoising. There's a variety of them for like shadows, caustics, indirect lighting, etc. And they're run all at the same time, or sequentially at least.
Yeah, I think the good thing about ray reconstruction and Portal and possibly these RTX Remix games is that the artwork is quite stark.
Yes.
And so when you want to get those reflections and you want to see the full sort of detail, it's kind of a bit off-putting when it's lower resolution. So ray reconstruction should really make a big difference there.
Right. Keeping it nice and crisp. Stuff like shadows, especially the reflections, making them like super
talking about, obviously there was the thing about Max Payne running at like 1,000 frames per second and then going down to 60.
Yeah,
I was having sort of like PTSD from when people were reviewing Portal RTX. So at like 1 frame per second or whatever. And it's just like, well, first of all, it's a question of, scaling with the hardware, and Portal actually has really good scalability and you can run it on a 2060 at variable frame rates. But it's just this kind of mentality of whacking everything up to ultra and that's how the game runs. It's like, no, yes, and no.
Yeah. Whacking things up to ultra is a big deal. And that's another thing. So there's other implementations that were announced. I think the one that a lot of people are going to be excited about are for Black Myth Wukong, a game that is kind of epic in how it's been showed off over time. The first trailer was a big wowing thing. That was back when it was still on UE4. It's just like everyone was like, whoa, look at those cool, wispy, moving like cloud particles that the Wukong character is fighting through. But since then, they've upgraded it to UE5. They're going to be using things like Nanite and Lumen. But also, they appear to be using now the Unreal Engine, at least 5.3 branch that Nvidia brought out, which, so in traditional UE5, the primary direct lighting is still done through traditional means. The shadows are done with VSMs, which is kind of like software ray tracing a shadow map. That's a really high res shadow map. But here, this would make so that with using RTX-DI, direct illumination, would make all of the light sources, no matter what, be shadow casting via ray tracing, which is actually a pretty big deal because even with something like VSM, you're still limited by traditional, like how many lights can you actually set up realistically to be shadow casting before your performance tanks. And one thing that RTX DI does that's really cool is it scales kind of with an infinite amount of shadow casting light sources. It doesn't have a limit there. It's just upper end N at that point, big N. And so any little light casting light source, little candles, things like that usually in a game would be either they just like put one large like point light for the entire area that maybe isn't even shadow casting. But for something like RTX DI, each little candle would be a light source that casts shadows, which is really cool. And it depends on the scene, obviously, but that could lead to really great differences or just minor ones, depending upon it. If it's an outdoor scene, maybe you won't notice the difference too much. They also announced for that ray trace caustics, which is going to be, I think, the first game we've seen from UE4 titles to actually use ray trace caustics, because UE4 had a branch that had them too, but not UE5 yet, which could look really, really great on stuff like water, or if they have some sort of like crystal in the game world and they actually set it up to use it. And then they also do mention maybe a different path for the indirect lighting, because right now you would probably be using Lumen hardware for the indirect lighting in the game, both reflections and diffuse lighting, so like rough surfaces getting their light. But as Oliver's talked about in like a number of videos covering UE5, or I did in my UE5 like checkup video, UE5 hardware Lumen has limitations that make sense to keep performance up. But like with all these things like Portal RTX running on like the very high setting, or this at all, these are like ultra settings to refine the game further, add in maybe new effects that not every GPU can run, but they're there to make the game in 10 years. If you load up Black Myth Wukong in 10 years and it has stuff like more or less path trace lighting, it's just going to scale indefinitely over time at that point, which is incredible. So that's why I'm always excited about announcements like this. And Black Myth Wukong, wow, it's already a good looking game and it'll just look better.
Yeah, fantastic. Oliver, well, let's sum up Alex's
long talk
notes there with, he described it as a big wowing thing.
Yes.
Would you concur with that?
I think it looks really, really impressive. To me, I think one of the more interesting things is that I think NVIDIA in these releases has stopped using the term path tracing as much. And so they're saying full ray tracing. So that's an interesting
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because it is selective, isn't it? Isn't it, Alex? Just quickly.
Yeah, they won't, for example, if they were to do all primary lighting via ray tracing, that would mean things like particles are done via ray tracing. Volumetrics are done via ray tracing. All transparency is done via ray tracing. So you'd get things like refraction when you look through something just by the nature of the algorithm. But doing that is kind of somewhat wasteful for a AAA game, because you would only be seeing the effects of it very rarely, and they're very complex topics to actually solve. Like, I don't actually think there is a generalized algorithm to ray trace volumetric fog, for example, from the camera perspective using triangles. Right. I don't think there is. So yeah.
Sorry, Oliver, I cut you off there.
But it is interesting here because, UE5 is already solving so many of these lighting problems already, using ray tracing even, that really like the NVIDIA contribution to this is just like RTX Ti and the ray trace caustics and stuff, and maybe something going on with the GI as well. But it is sort of interesting because like I looked at these shots and the game looks incredible, but I'd love to see this relative to the console build or the PC build running without these additions, because it already, this conceivably could look quite similar. I think absent the RTX Ti, which as you mentioned could make a big difference in some scenes.
Right.
So
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of hard to make exactly what if this is the NVIDIA contribution, whereas in some other titles, like when we looked at obviously a game like Cyberpunk or Dying Light 2 or something, the quote unquote RTX contribution over and above what you get as a feature set on the consoles is gigantic, right? And here I'm not sure it'll be that profound.
It would be interesting to see how it runs on with these features turned off, or indeed on an AMD card, just to see what the differences actually are. Yeah. Interesting. Let's return to the other announcements that were made. And just quickly, again, full RT in Naraka Blade Point. Again, this full RT thing. Can you decode that one, Alex?
Yeah, for here, I actually know why. So the reason why this game in particular doesn't seem to have a big difference from using full ray tracing versus like we've seen in the past is because this game is kind of old to the point where I think actually its indirect lighting solution, even while using RTX Di, the indirect lighting is being done by ray traced ambient occlusion, which, as we know, ambient occlusion is just a hack to kind of show indirect shadowing. And it has like a very large scale RTX GI being used for its indirect lighting. And RTX GI, as we've shown in titles in the past, like The Witcher 3's Enhanced Complete Edition, I think it's called. Was it the next gen remastering of it? As well as I recently covered the finals. It's just like probes that are placed around the world, and they figure out what color they should be and what objects are occluded on a very large scale from the probe's perspective using ray tracing. But you don't get that like per pixel goodness. Objects are still lit in the traditional probe-like way. It's just the thing informing the probe looks more accurate. So that's why it kind of looks like the reflections look better and the shadows look better thanks to RTX Di. But like the lighting in the trailer didn't look actually very flattering, I would say. And it's one thing that it's not going to be nearly as good looking as Wukong or some of the other titles we still have to talk about.
Right. The biggest dramatic head-to-head in that trailer is the ray reconstruction off versus on. So what's going on there?
Well, in that case, ray reconstruction can change the way shadows are done. It can change the way reflections are done very greatly, because if they're using an older denoiser, because this game is, once again, I think it's getting pretty old now. It's like one of the first RTX titles, if I recall. If they're using like an older denoiser there, everything is like free game at that point. Older denoisers are way inferior, for example, to more modern ones, especially something like ray reconstruction. So it can produce very different results.
Okay. Anything to add, Oliver?
Yeah, I did notice just a couple things. So if you look at the trailer, when they're switching between the RTX on and RTX off at about 15 seconds, if you look at the grass there and the bushes, they seem to lose shadows in the RT view. Yeah, they don't seem to look too good. At 14, 15 seconds, you lose the shadows on the grass and the bushes. So that does not look too hot. It kind of makes me wonder, maybe that's not in the BVH, who knows, but it's not looking too hot.
That would be pretty typical.
It looks really flat, actually, after the change there.
So that is a funny bug. If you recall back in, when I did cover some kind of rudimentary ray tracing stuff, like I kind of want to say when I looked at Chernobylite, I also pointed out the fact that some aspects of the game's visuals are not as good with ray tracing because they're using a ray tracing structure that doesn't include certain aspects of the geometry. And we've seen it in the past before in games where things that have shadow maps lose any form of shadowing when you turn on ray trace shadows, because the developer at that point in time was like, let's save some performance by not ray tracing against alpha tested geometry, which obviously is a pretty big mistake for a game being advertised as full ray tracing.
Yeah, it's slightly problematic, especially when it's taking up so much of the viewport in that particular shot.
Yeah, I mean, who knows how much they are actually updating this game and keeping it up. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like some ray tracing stuff is added onto games without a lot of super great oversight to what it actually does to the visuals at times. Specifically in those games that use Unreal Engine 4, where it is kind of just ticking a button there to turn on some ray tracing effects. Like, I think when I also looked at what was that game? The Cyborg Ninja one.
Ghost Runner.
Ghost Runner also added things like RTAO and RT shadows when the game had like fully baked direct lighting. Like, it almost made no sense to add those things because you couldn't see them, because there was already baked direct lighting anyway and indirect lighting. So yeah, for some games, RT, in this case, I think it could look better, obviously, if they did some other things, but the reflections look good. Okay. So there's that.
Fair enough. Well, let's move on. That's enough about the Racco Blade point. Okay, let's talk about Star Wars Outlaws, which is a game that we're hugely excited about for a whole number of reasons, not least because it's running on the Snowdrop engine. And as we saw with Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, this technology is just out there. Oliver, I'm going to go to you first here for your reactions to this trailer. It looks like RTDI has been added.
Yes.
But this is going to be interesting because obviously the game has ray tracing baked in if it's using the Snowdrop engine as standard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would guess that this would be similar to Avatar, so that would be RT reflections and RTGI. And then on top of that, you get RTXGI like you mentioned, or rather, sorry, RTXDI like you mentioned. So you get ray trace shadows on the PC version. The footage that I think we're seeing here looks a lot like the preview footage that we saw at Ubisoft Connect last year. Ubisoft Connect, Ubisoft.
I think it is.
I think it might be the exact same footage, down to the unstable frame rate and all that. My question, I guess, with this is that if full ray tracing is just ray tracing like most of the lighting, then why not call this full ray tracing if they're adding in RT shadows in with the RTGI and with the RT reflections, presumably, right? Then what's where is Nvidia kind of picking and choosing their monikers?
Yeah, where do you draw the line? That's the question.
Does it also need to have cost?
Nvidia features.
Yeah, it's confusing to me, but
I mean, I have no idea why. Maybe because they don't say it for the titles where the diffuse is not being done via some sort of like, because in this game it uses like a Metro Exodus style RTGI,
Right.
and maybe they don't say it for games that do that because they fall back. Like, what, are they really saying it for Nakara Blade Point?
Yes.
They do. Then this is absolutely nonsense at this point, this naming scheme, because ray tracing ambient occlusion is not what I would consider full ray tracing. I mean, it's arbitrary, but I also don't like the naming. I would actually I would say that whatever Outlaws is doing is more close to that, because one of the few weak points in Avatar's visuals is its shadow maps and like shadows in general. Like, there are non-shadow casting lights quite often found through the game world, and there's also the shadow maps aren't super high quality. And a game like that, I think, especially with Star Wars, where it's going to have even more artificial light sources than something like Avatar on Pandora. Like indoors you get a couple, but most of the time not. So I don't know. It seems very arbitrary, and I don't like the naming scheme anymore. And I should maybe send them a strongly worded email.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I don't think you get fixated on the naming. I just think it's interesting. Like, what's full ray tracing according to Nvidia? What's not? What's just it up there?
Yeah, who knows? But I guess one thing also, so I'm excited for this because I thought the weak point in Avatar's graphics was like the shadow map rendering. Also in like the original footage we saw here, like back then, there were a couple, it was an earlier footage, so it had a couple of issues, but one of the things that you could see that was like, oh yeah, this is totally real time, was like the shadow map rendering. You could see issues with it. And I think this will just make the game look way, way better. One thing that I thought was interesting about the press brief here regarding it is they say DLSS 3, but what it doesn't include then is DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction, which would be the only title here regarding these that are using RTXDI that wouldn't have it. And I don't know if this is just because they haven't integrated it or they won't have integrated it by release, but that'd be interesting, because it would kind of maybe then have issues like what we saw with Cyberpunk before it got ray reconstruction. So there could be like some larger lighting lag that occurs when things change rapidly, and certain things couldn't resolve so quickly. Or maybe they're using some sort of other denoiser for that instead, that the developers have made themselves. But that is very curious that they only say DLSS 3 and not 3.5.
Yeah, I think just to sort of round off the discussion on this, I mean, the game itself just looks phenomenal regardless. Even I think we saw some console footage, possibly, or possibly not. But,
I don't know.
The engine is fantastic, so I have no sort of issues with the game itself. Just to point out, though, this trailer is saying launching with DLSS 3 ray tracing and reflex, which doesn't say launching with full ray tracing. So, just to point out that they're not making any claims for full ray tracing. But I agree, it's kind of like a bit of a weird distinction at this point. But again, I guess it's great to have a Snowdrop game that does seem to have NVIDIA specific features. Well, it'd be great for NVIDIA owners, at least.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I like about it is because I really liked the unobtainium preset that was in Avatar, but it only added like small little features, or just the general thing that PC settings of old do, where they just pump up the sample count of everything. Yeah. So the one thing it did add is like you get now skinned objects and reflections, but they're sort of rare in the game anyway to see, so it wasn't a big deal. But here, with like what I consider really, really great ultra options, are ones that add new things on top, like like in Crysis' very high mode added in things like parallax occlusion mapping, per object motion blur, more refined HDR pipeline, and things like that, like things that change the visuals of the game in mostly every scene. I think those are great, very high to ultra settings.
Okay. The final game was the first Berserker Kazan. I hope I got the pronunciation there. It's just a DLSS 3 integration by the look of it, but any thoughts on the game itself?
No.
No
Oliver?
thoughts.
I think it looks good. You guys commented on it, I think, a couple weeks ago, maybe last week. I think it looks. It was in the Xbox demonstration, I think.
It was in the
Right.
Xbox thing.
Okay, yes.
John was definitely talking
It
about it.
looks like
yeah, but
very similar footage, if not the same footage, from what I can tell. So I don't think they're really revealing their hand there. But yeah, just the usual DLSS suite plus reflex. So
yeah, so it looks like frame gen and DLSS 2. Great. The game does
awesome.
Look good.
Can't complain.
But we
the one thing I
would
like to. One thing I want to say with all of these titles is if you have DLSS, you better include DLAA. Titles that have DLSS nowadays but don't have DLAA is a little bit sad because you have GPUs out there like the RTX 4070 Super, 4080, 4090 that can actually render modern games at their native resolution without the need of DLSS upscaling. So this gives those players something really great. And it's not too hard to actually implement. I'm pretty sure it's just one extra preset on the scale of presets.
Okay.
So it's just a UI thing, actually, at that point.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. Well, that's all we've got to talk about from Nvidia at the moment, though I understand there might be some more announcements that actually emerge at GDC. So stay tuned for that. Yeah. Wow.
It's a big wow thing.
It's a big wowing thing. Yes.
Yeah.
A bit like Black Myth Wukong. Let's move on to our next news topic. Okay, so earlier in the week we had a rather excellent, I think, video from Gamers Nexus where Steve Burke was talking to Intel's Tom Peterson about additions that have been made to the PresentMon benchmarking tool, specifically to address the concept that maybe frame time isn't the be-all and end-all of measurements when it comes to addressing performance. And there was a welcome focus on the bane of our existence, hashtag stutter struggle. Now, Alex, you watched the video. I think we all watched the video. It's definitely a step in the right direction. But correct me if I'm wrong here. Well, we'll talk about the animation rate stuff presently.
Sure.
I'm interested in this specifically because it was presented in the context of benchmarking within the context of, ascertaining the performance of a CPU or GPU. But I actually think that this is probably going to be of more importance to game reviews rather than ascertaining the performance of CPU and GPUs. But first of all, can you talk us through the things that are actually new here in benchmarking terms, why they're important, and this whole thing that was coming up in the video, the key intro was basically that frame rate and frame time isn't important anymore. This is kind of something new and more important, which I'm kind of certainly in partial agreement with, but I'm curious about your thoughts.
So I would say, even Tom Peterson says, they're making the joke about like, this is the hook, line, and sinker of the video, bury the lead, whatever. The whole point is that frame time stuttering, it gets you to about 90% of the way there to say that there's an issue with a game. If there's a great difference between frame time, and the next. And I think Gamers Nexus in the past has said that they consider something like a 4 millisecond difference between frames or something like that to be some sort of substantial amount that you can maybe see or feel. I think that is something that Steve has talked about in a video before, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And I agree with that sentiment, and I think it's great. But the frame time is only going to say how long did this frame take to render and present versus the next frame. But what it doesn't actually say is whether or not the motion represented in these frames as time-stamped by the CPU and which was used to render that frame is actually in sync with the frame time itself. Because if you think about it, though they can actually come off time from one another, and it can create it so that, yes, let's, for example, say that there's two 16.6 millisecond frames right next to each other. What if one actually was based on a CPU timestamp for the frame itself that was slightly longer than 16.6 milliseconds or shorter or whatever? You would have it so even though the frames are coming out within a similar amount of frame time, they could have different values of animation time having passed between them. So the visuals on screen won't actually look like fluid motion, even though the amount of the frame time in between frames is actually pretty much the exact same. This concept, you can look at this using PresentMon. I think, as Steve said in the video, can it be put out into a graph? And the idea is, yes, they're going to give you this data, And then you can kind of yourself put it into a graph if you like as well. And I think that is very useful for people reviewing not necessarily GPUs, I would say. I mean, a little bit. So the reason why I think Rich is trying to say that this is maybe better for game reviews than it is for GPU reviews is because this is going to be a per game thing. It won't be found across all titles, most likely, when you start seeing issues with this. It'll be a per game thing, and it could be a good way to say, on top of looking at things like stutters from large frame times, whether a game has other aspects of it. This will encompass that as well. It will literally represent stutters and frame time, but it can go one level further. The reason why it's maybe not so good for GPUs reviews is because kind of you're looking at the difference between GPUs and looking at the average experience. And usually if a game presents these issues, it's some sort of function of the driver and CPU interaction. And I don't think it's usually the difference between like an RTX 2060 and an RTX 2060 Super. Or it won't even necessarily be the difference between an RX 5700 and an RTX 2060 Super or something like that. This is something that I think that is more tied in with CPU things and to an aspect the driver and the game itself. So I think it's much more game specific and much more CPU specific. So maybe in a CPU benchmark, you could look at this between a CPU that has 3D cache and one that doesn't. And maybe there are differences in this value here. Maybe there isn't. But I think it isn't actually super useful for GPU reviews at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the purpose of a GPU review, although I'd like to change that to a certain degree, is,
yes,
how much is GPU A faster than GPU B? And these issues in terms of animation stutters, I guess we can call them, they will be common to the game. The impact of the GPU, it may well actually be the case that the faster your GPU is, the more errors you will get, which is a possibility. Because you're revealing the CPU constrainedness.
Yes. So this is why frame rate caps are so good, and we've seen it before where you can actually, since the CPU can be working on multiple frames at once, if you unencumber the CPU by inserting a frame cap so that it is not being fully utilized, it'll have more resources for the current frames being done. I actually bet this could be a great way to prove that you should not run games unlocked frame rate.
Right.
Oh, this is great. This is great. This could be awesome.
You're getting excited, I can tell.
I'm getting excited. If Tom was here, he'd be getting excited too. He'd like it.
If Matrix was here, he'd be getting excited too. Yeah, I mean, yes, that's my sort of takeaway from that, which is that it's a valuable tool to have because it's something that isn't exposed just by counting the amount of frames that come out of a GPU and their persistence, and it gets you more to the metal, so to speak. So I'm excited to see. I'm excited to experiment with it first of all in known problematic games with stutter, and also the games. I mean, I'm thinking back, Alex, to the likes of Hogwarts Legacy and Jedi Survivor.
Jedi Survivor would probably show this off incredibly well.
Because obviously, I mean, you could actually see in your captured feed that there was an issue with movement that wasn't working in concert with frame rate. There was something very weird going on there. So it'd be interesting to maybe sort of get down to the science of it, so to speak, and to actually know a bit more about what's going on there. The only thing I've really got to say about the Gamers Nexus video beyond the awesomeness of it is that just the concept of the bar charts, man, it's never really sat right with me, and errors per second doesn't really make sense to me when that data could be superimposed on the video, which actually gives you context about what the game is actually doing that could potentially cause these errors. So I do think that there's actually an additional step that's needed. Now, obviously, with PresentMon, you can use the overlays to do that. You can capture a feed from the game. But when it comes to competitive analysis, whether there is a difference between one GPU and another, PresentMon, well, you would actually just have two captured feeds and two graphs that aren't related more closely and it would be a bit confusing. So I think there's a foundation of stuff that we can do there to possibly add a bit more context to that. Was there anything else in that presentation? I mean, there was the latency stuff. They've got what looks like a software-based latency counter.
Right.
Which at the moment, FrameView has this. It uses what's known as reflex markers, where if a game supports reflex, then you kind of know the beginning and the end of the frame based on input to output, so to speak. It looks as though Intel now has a software solution to that, and it also has a hardware solution on top of that for increased precision. Any notes on that, Alex? I mean, I've got some thoughts on that. But
yeah, I mean, I like the idea of this maybe working without reflex markers and giving a good, it doesn't need to be 100%, but it can at least show you variation. So you can maybe not trust the end number, but you can trust the fact that there's variation between the end number, between different configurations. So that it would at least give you a scale where you don't know where the bottom of the X or the Y is, but you'd have a good sense, at least the differences. And I think that's very good to have. Well, what do you think about the hardware, Rich? I'm curious.
The hardware side of things kind of looks like LDAT 2.0, which is fine, except that it's based on the concept that you press the button on the mouse and then there's a change in luminance on the screen. And then, basically the time between those 2 points is calculated. And the issue I've had with that is that it's great for FPS games where you press a button, some sort of weapon is fired and it causes a bright flash on screen. However, how would you use that in Jedi Survivor? How would you use it in Hogwarts Legacy? How would you use it in any given fighting game? At that point, it becomes extremely difficult to actually find those luminance points. And therefore, it's only, in our experience with LDAT, unless this is doing something different, but I don't think it is, it's good for first-person shooters, and that's it, And this has been a real issue with mine, and this is why the reflex marker thing that Nvidia has put into FrameView is actually really, really good, because you just get a running total of latency, and it doesn't require user input. And I suspect maybe what Intel is doing is similar to that, but without the markers. Latency is extremely important. It's probably going to be the next big battleground, because there's going to come an end point where frame generation is just going to fill in all of the holes up to the refresh rate of your monitor. I mean, that's the end game. AMD told us that at Gamescom. So at that point, what is the cost of that frame generation? And it's going to be latency, and you need a good way of measuring that. So, yeah, interesting stuff. Oliver, this isn't really your bag, PC benchmarking, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
Well, I think it's the question as to how to present this information is sort of interesting. I do think you need some kind of history that shows you what the variance is in the current frame, because I think that's very useful with our frame time data that we display to people, because you can actually see, okay, here's the here's that frame time, here's that huge spike, you can see it coming up, and then it's on screen and you see it and it's noticeable, and it's something that you can really measure and show to people. I think that averaging it out over many frames over a period of seconds, it's not, to me, that's not, now we're getting into territory that's not as interesting personally.
I agree with that.
But I like that this should be a way to tackle some animation problems in games like Star Wars Jedi Survivor, like was mentioned, maybe like Dead Space as well, where you had some problems there.
Dead Space does have some
problems. Where you have unique frames without new animation, and that's obviously that's a big issue. But I think in most cases, frame time is still going to be a really useful metric, and obviously it's the only tool we have for console games, really examining the performance of console games and the performance variance in console games, rather, outside of an averaged frame per second figure.
I'm really interested in seeing what this metric actually does in a CPU review, where in theory your benchmark is going to be completely CPU limited, because you look at the frame times when you're heavily CPU limited, it's a total disaster. You don't want to play like that. I'm wondering whether it could actually work as a diagnostic tool of sorts for developers to actually improve some of that stuff. But likely not. I mean, it's CPU limited is a disastrous scenario. You just don't want to be there.
Sorry. The reason why I think that I would love for this kind of a tool to be used by developers to figure out issues with animation in games, and it would also point out issues in stuttering, because it tells you that as well too. It just tells you another layer on top of that.
Yep.
But if you look at FCAT back in the day when that came out, I think that only really was really important for the IHV vendor wars, and I don't think it changed anything about games necessarily. I think it just changed basically whether or not Nvidia could show that Crossfire was worse. And that was really about it. But yeah,
which is a shame. I mean,
which is a shame,
because we use it, and when you put it on a video overlay, you get a much better insight into what is actually happening in a game. You can kind of detect when your CPU or GPU limited, and you can actually see the impact of that in terms of the frame times. So yeah. I mean, our tools are due a big overhaul, and this is actually a really interesting addition that we want to add in. And it does look like moving to PresentMon presents a whole cornucopia of fascinating data that, if properly visualized, could be really transformational, I think, for both our reviews and our game reviews, hardware and software.
I agree.
I don't really have too much more to say about this, except I'm looking forward to going hands-on and actually seeing how useful the visualizations are. I would have gone hands-on by now, except I'm on location. Actually, while we're talking about on location, the last time I went on location and filmed a direct, people thought I was seeing like secret hardware. I'm not. I'm just away from the office. Just to be clear, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing Switch 2. I'm not seeing any other hardware.
He'd only say that if he was seeing it, though, don't you think?
This is true.
Oh dear. With that, let's move on. Okay, so this one is rather fascinating in that obviously Stellar Blade is looking to be another one of those big PlayStation 5 exclusives coming relatively soon. We should expect a demo at some point, not least because one went live for like less than an hour, I think last week, before it was removed. And there are some interesting things in terms of how it was removed. First of all, it was removed from the PlayStation Store. And secondly, even if you downloaded it, it no longer functioned. The license was defunct. Luckily, some bloke appears to have captured it all. And that video hasn't been pulled from YouTube. Oliver, I'm curious about your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, it's a weird state of affairs, because even with the Spider-Man 2 patch, like, Sony didn't proactively pull that from your system. I still have the 1.002
Have you gone
patch.
online with it, though?
I have gone online with it, and it did not update. Well, it tried to update, and I canceled the update. So,
okay.
It's only if I boot the game, it will try to update it if it's online, but I can cancel the update or start it offline. But yeah, they must really not want this out there. And obviously this is, not intended to be released. I presume it might be intended to be released at some point. It must be, right?
You'd think so. I mean, why make a demo?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. What?
Yeah, the demo looks a lot like the footage we've seen before. I think it resembles Nier Automata in a lot of ways. It seems quite heavily inspired by that game. That's really the big takeaway, I think. It looks good, but not exceptional. It's UE4, a bit of a cross-gen vibe. But the animation looks great. There are some frame rate issues in the footage that I saw. Looks to be targeting 60 FPS, not quite. Maybe in the 50s sometimes. Not a huge deal, but would be nice to see it improved. But of course, it's pre-release footage, and maybe this isn't even the version they intended to release. I think it probably is, but for the final game, it could be better, of course. So, yeah,
it would be bizarre for them to put out a demo that doesn't actually ever come out.
Yeah,
and I think it was. I honestly think somebody just pressed a button somewhere at Sony HQ, put the demo out. Somebody noticed it, and then it was like panic stations, and like all of the levers were pulled to withdraw that content. Although weirdly, the fact that the first 40 minutes of the demo are available to watch on YouTube, it looks like a quite substantial demo, and it does give you a good taste for the game, I think. And yeah, I mean, it looks fine. I mean, I don't think I've learnt too much more about it than I did from the previous footage that we saw, but it looks technically competent. And what more could you say?
I think the only thing I would love to say about this is it's so weird that Sony has the ability to take things off of your console. It kind of reminds me a little bit of when Microsoft weren't they disabling the emulation apps that people were using?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Right? And I was, that did not sit well with me at all. But this also doesn't sit well with me because I feel like the thing, like your console, it shouldn't be like some sort of licensed online machine that you use, but it should be like anything that is in it physically stored on hardware itself. The bytes are there. There should be no one that should be able to alter that other than yourself with your choice. And I feel like that is not cool. I wouldn't also be happy if Steam, for example, like deleted my weird installed demo of an old game. In fact, that's one of the cool things with Steam is you can use Steam DB to install things that are no longer available on Steam. Technically, they have like access to demos there. Steam still has them on their servers and you can connect them, but there's just no UI anymore in Steam to let you to do that. So you can do that with SteamDB, and that's really cool. But I don't like the precedent of them being able to take things off of your machine just because you're connected to the internet. That's really creepy, actually.
That is bizarre. I remember when Kratos came to Xbox in that War Gods game.
Zeus of Child.
Zeus of Child, yeah.
Sure.
I remember buying it, not just for the hilarity value of covering it on DF Direct, but, also to preserve it because, I thought that it would just, if I owned it, I owned it. I paid money for it. I will need to double check this, but I'm fairly sure that it doesn't work anymore, even though I bought it. I'd need to check that though, just to be clear. I do find the idea that a digital download on your machine can be deactivated at any point quite sort of disconcerting. But that's kind of like seems to be the direction of travel where we're heading, which isn't great. I'm just watching the first 40 minutes footage play out. I mean, it looks technically accomplished. I think the artwork's absolutely fine. It's all going to come down to how it plays ultimately, and I don't think we've got too much longer to wait until that is the case. But yeah, certainly an interesting sort of artifact of the digital age that things can be released, seemingly by accident, and then sort of withdrawn, and then all sort of evidence of it removed from your machine. It's a slightly bizarre state of affairs, but I guess it is what it is. But with that, let's move on to the next news topic. Okay, so our final news story of the week. Interesting interview with IGN with ex-Xbox boss Peter Moore. And basically he was talking about the perilous future of consoles, seemingly. Basically he believes that serious questions are being asked about the future of consoles at both Microsoft and Sony and just about anyone who makes consoles, I'd imagine. Okay, Oliver, I'm going to go to you first on this one. I do think it was a bit of an odd interview in many ways because, this is coming hot on the heels of Microsoft announcing that they're all in on Gen 10, which will deliver the greatest generational leaping capabilities that they've ever seen, apparently. So there was some odd perspective in this interview, but at the same time, there's no doubt that it is getting increasingly hard to produce cost-efficient, performant hardware. And at some point, it may well be the case that the end of the console is nigh. But I'm curious about what you thought about this interview.
Yeah, I don't really take it that seriously because people have been speculating about console business models for a long time. And obviously, we do know that there's a Gen 10 commitment from Microsoft and almost certainly one from Sony as well. But I think that people underestimate the extent to which the console business is extensible and adaptable because it can be games as a service oriented with cross-platform games like Fortnite that are on PC and mobile. They can be AAA centric with AAA titles that are platform exclusive like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, or it can be more like catalog titles like we see with Xbox Game Pass or PlayStation Plus Premium, or the backwards compatible titles that are available on both services and especially on the Xbox side. So it can be lots of different things. And I just think the plastic box that's in your living room can support so many different business models. And the industry is always moving and evolving and doing interesting new cross-platform things and whatnot. So I don't know. I don't really think too much of that. And then there are also areas that console holders can go down that we haven't seen so far. If you look at the PS4 and Xbox One, those were more conservative machines than the 360 at PS3. Gen 10, for all we know, could be another more conservative generation. I don't think it will be, but if they wanted to juice profits and slim down their game proposals further, slim down their offerings further, we've already seen some of that in the past few weeks. So I think you can give up some business probably to juice margins to some degree. In the long term, who knows how well that works, but in the short term, I think you can probably do it if you're interested in achieving that. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a bit of naysaying that doesn't really make sense in light of the console platform holders' commitments to upcoming hardware. Obviously, we know there's a new Nintendo console coming, and the other platform holders are probably accounted for there as well. So I think it's a little bit of doomsaying that doesn't have a whole lot of substance behind it, personally.
Doomsaying. There is an interesting quote in here, which I am going to read out. What I'm saying, this is from Peter Moore, by the way. What I'm saying is the questions are being asked, as they have been for the last 20 years. Are we ready to gird our loins financially for battle and all the cost of development, silicon development? What is it that PS6 could do that PS5 can't, that would make people jump from PS5? Or same with Xbox, same with Switch, right? God forbid it's just incremental. And I think that the companies are also looking at that. What can we do to extend this life cycle? And then if you're Microsoft and you're Phil Spencer, you've got Satya Nadella coming in saying, all right, what is the future here? And how does this play into the biggest strategy of cloud with Azure, with AI? What are we doing with AI game development? How do you make your games faster, cheaper, and with less people? These are all questions I think are being asked. I do think they are being asked, and I think to a certain extent they're being answered, right, Alex? I mean, we're talking about Microsoft promising this biggest generational leap ever. It's not going to come from transistors. They're not going to produce a new piece of silicon that's, got the largest jump proportionally of transistors. It's going to be because of AI. It's going to be because of stuff like frame generation that delivers that generational leap, but not necessarily through brute force hardware alone.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that sentence and that sentiment of it's the leap that will come, that they will try and sell as the biggest leap ever, will probably come from AI hardware and or AI enhancements to games that are not done locally, as in on the local machine, but maybe they're streamed in or maybe they're prepackaged in some way. And I think that is perhaps compelling and perhaps going to be what Microsoft leans on, and presumably Sony will too, to keep up with the Joneses. But the one thing that I actually do take away from Peter Moore here, Peter Moore, that's his name, right? I don't want to say it wrong.
Yes, it is.
Peter Moore. Peter Moore is that, okay, but how do you sell any of this to the audience?
Well, it comes down to great games, right? And this is why I think he's saying, God forbid it's just incremental.
Yeah, I mean, if it is literally just better lighting, or you can talk to a bartender in a game who tells you about his personal life, like the Nvidia demo, I think it really needs to be super compelling, and which I would agree with it. And I also think it's perhaps also the nervousness that John references multiple times with regards to the Switch 2. That, okay, so we already have the Switch and it already creates great single player or even multiplayer experiences that are directly from Nintendo themselves. Like, what does Switch 2 change about that necessarily, other than maybe better graphics and better performance? Is that enough of a selling point to move people over to it? And like you said, Rich, just like it needs some killer apps to make people get nervous enough, and I gotta play that game. My Switch doesn't. So yeah, but it's not like the most interesting way, I would say, to sell new hardware, just because it doesn't have some sort of game. But if it's offering an entirely new experience, then that I think is very exciting. Mm-hmm. I'm still not sold. I think AI is a great tool, going to be a very great tool for making development faster in some aspects, but I'm still not sold on the radical gameplay innovations it may cause without being demonstrated in a really great and fundamental way yet. I like being conservative regarding those things, just because you can overhype stuff so easily.
Yeah, I think the danger is that, precisely what we've seen with some of the RT upgrades that we've seen, it is incremental in a way. It's not baked into the game as a design imperative to use these features. Yeah. It's a bit of a problem, right? But then you see stuff like Cyberpunk path tracing it is a game changer in terms of visuals, at least.
Yeah.
My concern is that, the incremental stuff is going to happen simply because of the cost of development of games. I do think we're going to have another cross-gen situation when these new consoles come about, whether it's 2026 or 2028. And in that being the case, it's, they're going to be leaning into frame generation and AI-based upscaling, basically to make better versions of the games that you can get on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, which is going to be a bit of a problem. So they're going to need to produce the compelling experiences. And I honestly think that getting into, I've said this many times, getting into closer alignment with the PC space, where all of that stuff is happening already, and has been happening for the last year or so, a couple of years. I mean, that's basically key to it all. And that's where I'd be going if I was Microsoft and if I was Phil Spencer. And if I've got Satya Nadella coming in and saying, all right, what is the future here, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, that's an interesting point. I think the other thing that was interesting about the Peter Moore interview is the concept that these conversations have been happening now for the last 20 years, he says, but I don't think there was ever any doubt that there was going to be a successor to the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. But again, it did seem to be, fundamentally PC leading the way. It was the move to x86 and basically PC-like graphics architectures more closely than ever before. That was a bit of a game changer there, especially for Sony.
Yeah.
Any more thoughts on this one, Oliver?
I also just happen to think that with the way that generative AI is moving and moving very quickly in all kinds of exciting ways with LLMs, with video generation, with all kinds of very interesting and potentially accelerating AI developments, that if I'm a platform holder that's looking at a console and looking at interactive entertainment where AI has some interesting potential, that I'd want to say that's a potentially very high upside area of AI to move into and obviously speed up development, maybe have some very, very interesting and compelling applications on the rendering side as well. I'd want to be in on that generation just because of the upside potential. And it's a lot easier to say, oh, wow, there's a cool new AI thing we can integrate in game development, we can integrate into rendering. Let's integrate it in our existing platform or our upcoming platform, then say, oh, where someone sitting in the position of, well, we want to have a console platform now because games all of a sudden are a lot more interesting, right? It's much easier to be there if you're already there. So I kind of tend to think that if I'm Microsoft, if I'm Satya Nadella, I'm thinking about a future Xbox as a great platform to get all my Azure AI stuff in there and just see what happens.
Yeah. That's an interesting point because we are seeing this unprecedented scaling of compute, specifically for AI, and with Microsoft at the forefront of that. In many ways, I do think that they're probably looking at this very, very closely and saying, right, what can we do with it? I think there's always going to be an issue when you're talking about offloading some AI stuff into the cloud, that there's this massive latency issue that you can't really overcome unless you're doing it preemptively. I mean, this is the sort of situation where you just don't know what's going to happen because, the whole thing is in a state of flux. I mean, the leaps we've seen in AI tooling in the last 2 years, 18 months, a year even. When was your first AI video, Oliver? Because that was
a year and a half ago.
Right, because that's where things really started to get interesting, right?
Yeah.
Right.
It's like, the image stuff, and then GPT-4 was released exactly a year ago today, actually, or a year ago yesterday, I think. So that was like the huge LLM breakthrough that really brought LLMs to the forefront. But yeah, certainly it's been a pretty wild 18 months.
And we've had the Copilot stuff integrated into Windows now, which is basically, isn't that like the best form of Chat GPT?
Yeah, that's GPT-4. Yeah.
And it's free, essentially.
Yeah,
So,
with a Windows license.
I mean,
or even not.
with a Windows license, yes.
Maybe even not with a Windows license. Who knows? Yeah.
I think, that is basically the next frontier, right? The whole AI stuff and what it could do for games. We've seen some interesting demos. We've obviously got frame generation, which I guess that doesn't specifically need AI, but it certainly helps. And DLSS, where it has been the kind of defining factor of what made it better, ultimately. So, yeah, I mean, sky's the limit there. I guess we just have to wait and see. The power of the cloud may yet be a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious. Like, I think it actually does have maybe some very compelling cases for games that are multi-generational, as well as ones that thrive on social meta experiences. So, in a game like Fortnite, which now, for example, has, oh god, I don't even want to theorize, but I think it actually, for like individual single player games that are made by Naughty Dog, I can't actually look at you right now and tell you what it could mean, but I could imagine games that have much more freeform social experiences that AI could apply to them much more readily because they're always online already anyway. They have cloud integrations to some degree. Content is, I hate the word content, but content is a huge part of them, like adding in new stuff all the time. Play as Marvel Avengers with Nicki Minaj. Like, you know, like you can imagine ways they can plug in AI into that to make that even better, even more stuff all the time. You know what I mean?
Nicki Minaj everywhere, basically.
Nicki Minaj is in every game.
I like the way you sort of migrated her away from Call of Duty, which I think was the original.
Yeah, the original, the true OGs, the original Nicki Minaj integration.
This is the future of gaming.
Oh my goodness.
You heard it here first.
It's okay. I still got my old PCs. I still got my Windows 98 if I ever decide to tune out. So I'm good.
That went off on a tangent, didn't it?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. But yeah, these Fortnite games, man.
I do find it quite interesting that he was talking, going back to Peter Moore.
Peter Moore.
He is real. He's not in
He's
Call
real.
of
He's
Duty
not an AI
Warzone.
construct.
They were talking about this being a thing even up to the Xbox 360 generation. They were wondering, where to go next. And, I think we've talked about how the consoles that followed weren't quite as cutting edge. They were a lot more conservative. They weren't on the cutting edge process nodes. They used compromised, shall we say, CPU cores, but they had pretty good GPUs. So, yeah, I mean, where we go from here is, I think it's definitely going to be more of a kind of software/hardware integration of AI features. That's the next big frontier. That's where all the money's going. And the cloud stuff could be interesting, but there's still going to be that latency issue. Anything more to add to that? I mean, read the interview on IGN. It's quite interesting. But yes, I mean, there are going to be new consoles because, Microsoft has said so. That's it. That's the end of the news session for this week. So let's move on now to supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where, as always, we take a range of questions from our supporters on our Patreon site. And we choose the best ones, or rather the ones that catch our eye or are easiest or we're best equipped to answer, shall we say. A ton of great ones this week, but yes, we're going to be moving some of those ones into our DF indirect supporter-only show, and expect some of those questions to appear on DF clips in due course. Let's start off with this initial question from Alexander Seidel. Following on 2 points on the last Direct, you mentioned that console games like Dragon's Dogma 2 still release with weird frame rate decisions that could be enhanced by relatively simple tweaks. You also again praised SteamOS for giving users PC gaming options in a console-like container, specifically the side menu for scaling and frame rate options. Is it time for console makers to offer similar functionality of locking frames and refresh rates in a simple menu? They could call it a dev menu and have it be quote-unquote experimental until the end of time to pretend it like it's not a real option. It's kind of like the Here Be Dragons thing that was attached to PlayStation 4 Pro Boost Mode. Oliver, I'm going to go to you first on this. Inbuilt console frame rate limiters. Do you think it's a good thing, and do you think it's actually able to be implemented?
I think it's a cool idea. I think it should be implementable. It's just a system call. I don't see why it wouldn't be. I do think there's a lot of room for tweaks like this. I would wonder, the only thing I'd wonder about is input latency, right? Because some of these frame rate limiters, especially on like the Steam Deck, and I believe what we've heard about from about the Sony system level frame rate limiter, and maybe the Microsoft one as well, is that they can induce some bad input latency, and we've seen that. You see that on the PC side as well.
Yeah, it's basically buffering frames, right?
Yeah. So that would be my concern. But I think that like if developers aren't handling this stuff in the way that we would prefer, because you can't expect everyone to handle it in the way that we would prefer or like are the best practices, especially from certain, I would say, not to stereotype, but certain Japanese developers don't tend to go with this trend. Obviously, you've got Capcom. Certain developers tend to have different views on this stuff, and I would certainly like to see something like this introduced just because of those edge cases.
Right. Mm-hmm. Interesting points. Alex, thoughts on this one? I'll just to interject just quickly, my viewpoint on it is that possibly doable on Xbox because it's using DirectX. PlayStation, I'm not sure about because it's a thinner API as I understand it, and more to the point, sometimes developers integrate their own frame rate caps, which may not be done on a system level, which may cause problems if they're kind of like married up to a system level integration there. Curious what you think about this though.
So yeah, also like I was going to mention that I think it's completely doable from the Xbox side, actually. The one thing I always think about with PlayStation is that I think of a game as using VSync and it isn't like manually coding its VSync. And I think game developers do that though. Pretty sure the Call of Duty series does. That's why they always have weird tearing that doesn't seem to be, like it's not like a system call. It's only tearing to a certain part of the screen. Usually they're deciding when to flip, not the,
I think that is actually maybe a system thing on Xbox. I'm not 100% sure.
It may be a system thing on Xbox, but I think for the PlayStation side, as long as it's using VSync and they are letting the console decide whether or not VSync is on, which I think a lot of games are probably doing, I imagine Sony could say, okay, what type of VSync is this? We can just dupe the call from our side, from the OS side with the flip. So I think that should be possible. The other thing, though, I don't think is as possible, like the other 120 hertz thing, which is why the low frame rate compensation stuff doesn't work on Sony without it being manually implemented. I don't know, but I would also love to see a Steam OS style. You hit the back button, hold it longer or something. And then you all of a sudden get a menu that says, okay, you're in VRR. Would you like to limit to 48 FPS? And you say yes. I think that'd be great.
It would be nice to have VRR on Steam Deck, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. But I was just saying like the console experience.
Yeah. I get what you mean. Yeah. I think it would be tricky because the whole point of a console, and it is kind of more applicable, I think, based on what developers have said in the past to us, it is kind of like low-level access to the silicon, and there's no guarantees that it will work or not. There is actually a bit of software that Illusion did for PlayStation 5 for exploited consoles that allow you to use the system-level VSync options, and I'm presuming that would include the 30 FPS option. And I believe it only works on some games, so it could be a bit more problematic there. Are there any other options beyond frame rate limiters that you think would be nice based on the Steam Deck experience? I'm guessing probably not.
System level integer scaling, that should be doable.
That should be doable just off the, it should just be a dashboard option. That shouldn't actually be game specific. Actually, it could be game specific, DRS, stuff like that. Some developers like to use
even FSR1 for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth.
I don't know.
If I could set it to
maybe for FFR Rebirth.
give me a 1080p image and then just scale it themselves, that'd be nice. But.
Sure. Okay. I could see that. I think integer scaling, I think that maybe more refresh rate control.
Right.
I don't know. Right. Because, there's that weird allow 50 hertz option, which applies to movie content, or what does it even apply to anymore in the Xbox menu? Like, what does it seriously apply to?
Possibly there are 50 hertz Blu-ray movies.
Possibly. But the fact that they do that is interesting. And the fact that they've, in the past, turned on triple buffering for back compat titles and...
Yeah, there's a lot going on there, but there's a lot of curation as well, I think.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think of anyone, Microsoft could do it, and they've supported semi, like experimental stuff in the past before. So I think they could do it.
Yeah,
I've just got sort of visions of the Microsoft ATG team listening to this and going, no, he doesn't understand.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, at that point, but like, man, just all those options, they're great. Hide them in a menu that you have to like enter the Konami code to get into if you're afraid of people using it. I would be fine with that. Give the power user something to do that is fun.
It would be fun, but ultimately, if you're really into this stuff, I mean, the bottom line is a console is supposed to be a curated experience, and we're kind of suggesting here, yeah, well, you know, the curation isn't particularly good on some titles, and it could be better. Whereas the whole point of a PC is that they aren't particularly sort of targeting specific hardware with game code. And it does require, in some states, the idea that the user can intervene. So I do think fundamentally they are different things, but there is some nice stuff going on here that could possibly make its way over. And with that, I think we should move on to the next question. This one from Sir Lankil, or Sir Lanky the Third.
Sure.
Yeah, I think so. Once ray tracing and path tracing become more settled technologies, what do you think the next major rendering or simulation tech will take center stage? Will we get more extensive use of object soft body and cloth physics, or is it likely to be something more AI related? Could it even be something else completely out of left field? Oliver?
Yeah, I kind of tend to think that the direction of travel ultimately is probably towards something where you're combining a game engine with some kind of AI generation model, generative AI model that takes input from the game engine. Like obviously could be simple graphical input, could be material IDs, could be motion vectors, could be a lot of different inputs, and then takes that to a model that modifies that in real time to produce a great looking image or a very stylized image. Or even something that relies on the AI for other capabilities, like Sora seems to have its own like physics and all this other stuff embedded in it, in latent space. So I think that to me, I think that there is like some interesting stuff that people have been doing just with image models, but I think that is an area where I would expect to see some, like, if you ask me like what will things look like in a few years, I think people will probably be trying to do something with that. But I don't know how far away that is necessarily, but I think that to me seems like the end point. If you look at AI video generation, suppose that will become extremely optimized, and then look at what that would do with a game engine. I think that would be a very potent combination potentially.
Right.
Okay. Alex?
I like that idea. I actually like it a lot, and it does tie in a little bit with Tom Peterson told us almost 1.5 years ago now, where we talked about frame gen. At that point, we talked about XeSS, but then he was talking about, but like, what about like modifying geometry with AI? And I honestly, with something like Nanite, where the base, like, the model could be completely unoptimized with Nanite. Like, you could shove unoptimized models in Nanite, and the whole point is Nanite's optimizing it for the pixel density of your screen. AI models are already capable of generating very inefficient 3D models just out of nothing. I mean, they're probably trained on real data, obviously, of real models. That's how they do it. But the whole point is it can just give you it with a prompt or based upon a 2D image that is scanned in. And I think that could be actually a very interesting future for games that have a lot of different needs that go beyond what artist working hours can provide. Not to replace artists, but enhance the artist output. And I think that'd be very cool. But for me, I would really like physics stuff to come back. I've been playing with a physics card recently. All of the games I've played have way better physics than games that come out nowadays. Your Uncharted, your Lost Legacies, your God of War, they all have like zero physics in comparison to games that came out in 2004 to 2008. It's kind of crazy, actually, and it makes Alex, me really sad.
You're forgetting the Reddit meme of in Uncharted shooting a bunch of rocks and they fall down the hill.
I mean, there's a lot of ways one can do that don't even require real-time physics. I don't even know if it uses real-time physics, to be completely honest with you, because I've never shot those rocks to investigate it. It could, it could be a played-back animation with a moving texture underneath it to simulate the look of the stones moving. That's the whole thing. But like at one point in time, that was in vogue, and I was super excited for it. And now I'm super excited for it. Like, other than like weird experimental indie games like we saw Sebi's Claybook that did interesting things with physics, or Teardown.
Right.
Modern AA to AAA games, it's not about that anymore. And I think that's so fun. I love the user agency that caused. I love the wacky bugs that you can show off on YouTube as a result of them. I think it's a very different style of play, one that engages my, brain a lot more than cutscenes do. So I would love to see that return after we do path tracing for most of the image. I don't think it's actually still very reasonable to do everything via path tracing, even in the next 5 years. I think I'd rather see those cycles. I don't think you need a path trace volumetric lighting, like I said earlier. I'd rather see those cycles be used for something else. And our GPUs are so big, they could do PhysX stuff nowadays way better than we saw in 2005 to 2008 or whatever. But we don't see it anymore. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I kind of get where you're coming from with physics, because when we talk about what stuff like RTGI is doing, RT shadows, it's just stuff that inherently looks right. Okay, just because of the nature of ray tracing. But when you are in a game and you can hide behind an extremely flimsy piece of scenery that should be blown to pieces with the amount of artillery that's going on, from a gameplay perspective, that isn't right. So the concept of being able to move towards basically a much more holistic model of physics that just works, that developers maybe don't need to think about quite as much. That would be quite interesting as a kind of next stage.
Or even you just look at old CG, from, it could be 15 years ago, it could be 20 years ago. And the kinds of soft body physics they have going on, the kinds of cloth, the kinds of flesh, the kinds of hair, in particular hair. The kinds of physics they have going on there is so much beyond anything that we have going on in real time outside of canned animation, It's just
exactly.
pretty intense. And I think that gulf is far bigger than the gulf, certainly in rendering quality, general rendering quality, right? Between what we have right now in real time and what we had back then in pre-render. So I think that's definitely an area where I'd like to see some improvement.
Yeah, I think the thing with physics is that you do see some really interesting physics work in games, but a lot of it is pre-calculated, and then played back. So it kind of gives the illusion of something that's kind of like physics, but it's not really real-time generated or as dynamic as you might hope. And then you look at stuff like, I guess most recently, the finals. It's still using time-honored techniques to give that effect, but it's still not quite the level of realism that you would expect. But it does look great.
It looks good, yeah. But this is one if you play any game, also another thing is just actual clothing being on characters that is deformed versus the bones of the character deforming the clothes. This is one thing that you'll see in any game with armor, and it looks so bad. If you actually look at it, you're wait a minute, that guy's armored cuirass is bending with his arm, and it's oh my god, if real armor did that, it'd be useless. But and it also just doesn't look physically plausible when you watch people move. That's one thing I would love to see in games as well too in the future. Apparel on characters are separate physicalized objects that interact with their body as well as with the environment. Super rare to see, actually.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one from Passive Meanness.
What? Okay.
Hey gents, exclamation point. Following the recent content covering Marvel's Spider-Man Spy debug menu, that one's for you, Alex, I guess, that was accidentally added via a patch, do you think more devs should add debug menus on games via Easter eggs for us curious who just want to mess about, just like the good old days? I think it provides great insight in how games work under the curtains, behind the curtains maybe, and is really fun. Exclamation point. And speaking of Marvel's Spider-Man 1040 STF, actually we'll go to you first on this, Oliver. He asks, will Oliver keep his PS5 offline for all eternity now?
So I have, I have since reconnected my PS5 to the internet. There have been no issues with re-downloading the patch. And my belief is that as long as I launch the game and then immediately cancel the download or launch it offline, that I will not have to download that patch unless Sony does something on their end that is abnormal. Then I should have no issues, and I don't plan to update the game for a while. Maybe I'll run it on a PS5 Pro down the line or something. See how it works.
Maybe you can copy it off
sick.
to external storage.
Yeah. I'm also
that might work.
Going to try that. Yeah. So hopefully it'll be okay.
But the question, do you think more games should have accessible debug menus? Just for the Easter egg value.
I mean, I think I'd love that. I think it's a great way to explore games and see what's going on under the hood. I certainly think with Spider-Man, it was really interesting, especially the performance metrics, which gave us some insight into how that game runs that you don't normally get. Like you can just approximate resolutions, but you don't actually see it in real time, and all the processor loaded information. That was just really cool. Very PC-like in that respect. Mm-hmm. But obviously there's stuff they don't want you to see. I don't think they wanted you to see the unfinished content, the unfinished levels, clipping into buildings, going under the world. Maybe there's stuff in there. Probably they don't want you to see the resolution information either, but maybe that's not quite as damaging potentially. It's just seeing a lot of unfinished content. So I totally understand the commercial and editorial imperative to keep that content away from my grubby hands.
Yeah, I think ultimately it comes down again to the sort of stuff you could possibly expect to see modded into PC or these debug menus exposed via mods, but it's not something that a console experience, which is, as I've said, curated to a certain degree, it's not something that's typically shown, which made the Marvel Spider-Man patch all the more intriguing just because it was a novelty and you did get to see those metrics and those various modes and weird possibilities there. Thoughts there on this question from Passive Venus?
Yeah, I was just about to say, did I write this? Because it not only has a nice German in there,
did you?
Which is funny, but it also uses an idiom incorrectly, which is something I do all the time.
Well, under the curtains.
Under the curtains. I could have said that. Yes, I would always like to see this. I don't think it's something that would probably ever be a norm on consoles for the reasons Oliver said, but I think still some PC developers out there do these kind of things. For example, praise to id and any of their id Tech games for having the extended performance metrics, which do tell you when a CPU dropped frame occurs for the exact same thing. They also have a resolution monitor that tells you what resolution is being used. Currently, if you have DRS on, they do these things and it's awesome. And I almost wish they enabled them the Xbox and PS5 builds. But that won't happen. But in the good old days, as Passive Meanness here says, yes, this was all stuff that if you ship the PC game, it could be a launch parameter. It could be an in-game console setting that you just that was the really good stuff. And I do miss it.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move on to the next question then. From Shalon Ogden. Hello, gentlemen, and my best wishes to all of you. That's very kind. Thank you for all your hard work. Your work ethic is admirable. I wanted to know if you could talk about the different storage options you use when working on projects, as I have noticed that your video files you produce are on the bigger side. Do you use a lot of solid state technology when working? Thank you, and please take care. I'm not quite sure how you work, Oliver, so I'm quite interested in how you produce this, because our workflow is obviously 100% PC-based using Adobe Premiere, and that includes plugins that enable us to plot our FPS graphs and whatnot, whereas you work on Mac with Final Cut Pro, as I understand it. But what is the storage implications of the files that we're dealing with here? Yeah,
they tend to be pretty big. But for me, I work off of a Mac Studio with an 8 terabyte SSD. So I have quite a lot of space for that stuff. But I also like to keep lots of projects on there at once. So I have lots of material. And if something gets referenced in a DF Direct, it's helpful to go back and find it. So that has some work implications for me. But yeah, I work off of that computer, and I archive on hard drives. And I have my capture computer back there. I take all the stuff from that computer, I encode it, I get all the frame rate information off from rendered video files off Premiere, and I work that way. So that works for me. But yeah.
How do you transfer them over to the Mac?
Just using a Pocket SSD. But yeah,
Wow.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'm mostly on that 8 terabyte internal SSD, and that's very high bandwidth as well. It's a very fast SSD, as you might expect.
Is it possible to do easy wired transfers over the network from Mac OS to Windows PCs? I haven't done it in a long time. It used to be.
Yeah, this way seems to work okay. I'm not transferring an enormous amount. It's not too inconvenient, but I could do it over lots of things. Could do it over Ethernet. Could do it a million different ways.
Over the network and under the curtain.
Under the covers or under the curtain, as maybe said.
Yeah, I mean, just to give an idea of what happens, basically, we want the best quality in terms of captures from start to finish, right? But back in the day with Digital Foundry, we used mathematically lossless compression. So 720p, that would be okay, right? The files would be, I think, sort of typically 30 to 100 megabytes per second. But that is still very, very large. But the point is that you kept the quality from start to end. And then the only quality hit was when you went on the export and the upload to YouTube. But moving to 4K, we have moved to lossy codecs. Simply because when you're dealing with 4K files, or even 1080p, if you're being honest, some of these lossy codecs can be really, really good quality, and you don't really, bearing in mind the amount of compromise there is at YouTube at the other end, you don't really see it. So that kind of makes sense. But yeah, in terms of file sizes, even at 4K, I think we're talking about like sort of anything from 50 megabyte per second up to like 300. Depending on the complexity of the content. That is pretty big. I'm not sure which files Shalon Ogden is referring to here, whether he's talking about the videos downloaded from df.net, but even they are actually very compressed compared to the internal files that we use. I've got like a couple of 4 terabyte NVMe drives. I've got a 4 terabyte SATA SSD, and I've also got an 8 terabyte SATA SSD because, the more material you have, the better your edit generally, but also it means that you need a lot more space. And then in terms of storage at the back end, once the project is done, I use NVEnc to compress the file down still further, but with very short keyframe intervals so that footage can still be used in an editing environment. It's kind of like a good backup solution.
Right.
Alex.
Yeah. Similar setup to Rich. Rich provided me with a great 4 terabyte scratch disk, which I use to do most of my recording. And as long as it is we're using Cineform typically, if I'm using Cineform, it can cover the entire game. Like, I can record for so long in Cineform quality at 4K using that 4 terabyte. But for other things, like when I do 4K 120 hertz capture, Cineform isn't great, so I use Magic YUV there. And the size of that is huge, so I have way less space. So then I have to start juggling internally with other drives that I have to offload some footage. Sometimes I also, in the middle of a project, when I realize that I'm capturing multiple games or I'm capturing 4K 120, and I think actually for example, if I'm showing a game in B-roll, I want it usually in pretty high quality. But if I'm showing performance capture footage with the overlay in front of it, I actually allow myself it to be more compressed because I say what you're caring about is the frame time graph and less about the quality of the visuals. Yeah. So sometimes in the middle of a project, I will do some other encodes, usually NVEnc, in a way that is good on the timeline, and it shrinks the file size usually in half or even more. Then after I finish a video, I don't re-encode all of my B-roll always. What I do is I take specific spots of it, as well as any of the performance capture specific stuff I did where I did like benches, and then I'll encode them into a compromised NVENC just like Rich does, and I store them away on SSDs.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that we talk about compromised video quality, but you won't see it on YouTube for sure.
It's still better than YouTube. It's still better than
still
YouTube.
Like an order of magnitude better than YouTube compression. So, you typically won't see it. And we do need a storage solution that does actually produce workable files that you can, back up without having to spend, $300 on a 20 terabyte drive every month.
Yeah. And like,
right.
For reference, like even off a pretty compressed NVENC file, you can easily do like pixel counts and stuff like that, like super fine. The detail's still preserved to, especially like all this stuff, silhouettes and stuff like that.
Silhouettes are still great.
It's still preserved quite a lot. And especially for YouTube. I mean, YouTube is brutal to our videos. You would not believe how bad it is relative to what you see on the timeline or what you would see with certainly with one of the downloaded videos off df.net, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that, sometimes Linus puts out videos on his mammoth storage solutions. And this is just like, we're using essentially consumer level, maybe not quite in the terms of Oliver's Mac Studio, but it is consumer level hardware, which and consumer level storage solutions that we've had to adapt our workflow to work with that. So the concept of having these massive server farms, it's just, we're just using off the shelf parts really. There's nothing crazy or, enterprise level about it. But it works.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the final question. This one from Ang ETF. Hope I got that pronunciation right. Hello, Digital Founders. What would have DF looked like in the 90s with the rise of home computers for gaming? Kind of happened in the 80s, that one, I think. The first the quote unquote first 3D games and the beginnings of the interwebs. I suppose I'm best suited to answer that. But Alex, you were about in the 90s gaming.
I was. There were capture cards back then to a somewhat degree. You could like plug things in and get like a TV signal on your computer. That was a thing. I'm pretty sure you could probably record them. I just don't like the size of the files. There were not great compression codecs back then. Where would you upload these videos to? What would this all be about? What would even DF do? Would it be a magazine article? Rich?
Yes, it would be. But first, Oliver, thoughts on a kind of 90s DF? Do you think it would have been interesting?
Well, I wasn't really gaming too much in the 90s, but I was certainly gaming in the early 2000s. And I remember, picking up my magazines, my OXM, my PC Gamer and whatnot. And those all came with packing discs for the most part, or at least very often they'd come with packing discs. So I would think that if you're doing DF in the 90s, that it would probably be a magazine with high DPI images scattered throughout, certainly beyond the capabilities of most 56K modems to display at a reasonable period of time. And you'd combine text and images, and then maybe you'd also have some packing discs with some, low bitrate video on a CD. I'd expect that would probably be the situation, and some images, I imagine, as well. I think that'd probably be how it would go. I don't know.
That's an interesting point, because obviously I was there in the 90s and I was aware of the technology that we used for doing magazines because I was using magazines. So how do we begin here? I think, first of all, you talk about concept-wise, a lot of what we do works because there's a sharing attitude between game developers that just wasn't there in the 90s. You had forums like SIGGRAPH and GDC coming into the fore kind of like in the 2000s. And there was a much more sort of wider sharing of information, whereas in the 90s, everything was a lot more closed. And you kind of saw occasional things happening in the Amiga space, I guess. The UK Games Press did speak to developers. That was quite interesting. It was only really when Edge came about in Edge magazine by Future Publishing, I think that was like 94, 95, where you actually had a stronger focus on developers. But even then, they weren't really talking that much about graphics technology. So a lot of what we do at Digital Foundry is informed by the fact that there is this disclosure about how things work in gaming these days, which is, instrumental in producing Digital Foundry. So a DF from the 90s would have necessarily been quite different. Frame rate analysis just would never have happened. I guess in the 90s there were capture cards. We used them. We used, I think, first of all in 90, I'm thinking 1994 for some reason. That would make sense. But they didn't capture full frame rate. So you could have had full resolution, but you would have not had full frame rate. So you wouldn't have been able to do frame rate analysis. It would have been eyeballed. There weren't high-speed cameras. I suppose you could point a camcorder at the screen, but that would be problematic as well. So yeah, I mean, it would have been more of a conceptual thing about what's happening. What does this new hardware do? Pressing for interviews with the creators of the hardware, talking to developers, trying to get them to open up a bit more about the technical side of things, which I guess nobody really even tried until like Edge started.
Right.
There was still this sort of subjective view, particularly when Super NES came about, of slowdown, quote unquote slowdown, where games were just literally slowing down. You'd have a frame rate drop, but it would actually be tied to the speed of the game, which happened quite a lot on SNES titles. It would have been a nice way to quantify that, but you wouldn't have been able to do it with the technology of the time. I think the other thing is when you're in the 16-bit era, the amount of titles where you could have talked in DF terms would have been quite sparing. I mean, there was some great stuff, obviously, but looking back retrospectively, you're looking at an entire console era and picking out individual titles, as opposed to doing it on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis as we do these days. So it would have been a very different thing, but very interesting when a properly epoch-making game came along, like, Wolfenstein 3D or Doom. When Doom came along, it was kind of like, wow, this is just incredible. But I guess there wasn't really that much of an attempt by the press to dig deep into why it was so amazing. It kind of just was. You were looking more to the sort of dot plan stuff that Carmack and Sweeney were doing at the time there. What do you think about that, Alex, specifically? I guess once we move into the PC era of the graphics accelerator, which is kind of like, then something more recognizably DF could have been done.
Yes, I think at that point in time, that's when you started seeing real comparisons about frame rates in games, usually using time demos. So it was usually at that point in time, up until Fraps came about, it was all relying on whatever a game could allow you to measure using it, or you'd have like marks, like system benchmarks that you can install via DOS that would give you like a mark score for certain things. I think that's when you could start doing it a lot more. And I think that would have been a really interesting era for DF like footage or like analysis to come about, because nowadays, I think one thing that when you go back in time and look at any older, specifically graphics accelerator reviews, they are comparing things where like they are doing like totally like CPU limited stuff at times and they're not realizing it. They're doing GPU limited stuff at the time and they're like, all these processors are the same. And like nowadays we get the idea. We know that these things are very different. And we like that insight at the time would have given like, I think, a much better consumer experience. People would have realized that they don't need some X graphics accelerator, or maybe they do, especially in the graphics accelerator wars when the 3DFX Voodoo and Voodoo 2 would actually offer the game so it looks like a game. And then you'd have your, other weirdo random DX6 capable graphics accelerator having a game that has 3D polygons in it, but it's missing all the lighting. It's missing everything. Like, these things were not great. There was not a lot of consumer information back then. And I think that stuff could have really helped.
Yeah, that would have been like, the classic example, I got the Rendition Verite GPU to play Quake at high resolution or high frame rate, hardware accelerating. Then of course Carmack blew it all out of the water with his support for OpenGL for the Voodoo cards, which was just quantifiably better. But how do you quantify it? That would have been quite interesting I guess there was stuff happening at that time that would have made that possible.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I've just been thinking, in 1999 we had a frame grabber specifically for Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and that actually buffered the last 5 seconds of gameplay, which possibly maybe it could have buffered more frames. and at a higher frame rate. The idea that we used for buffering then was basically, if you were playing a game through a frame grabber and you saw something great happen, you didn't have to suddenly press the capture button to get that moment, because you wouldn't get it. So the idea was that you could pause, go back through your buffer and choose that precise shot that actually made a game look great, that tried to capture that experience in a static image. So maybe that would have been, if we were thinking about frame rate analysis. Frame rate analysis happened in 2008, I think, where, I was capturing HDMI raw at 720p 60, and it was like, well, hold on a minute, why don't we count the frames in any given second? And then you had an frame rate analysis, and then you plotted it over a graph. Those graphs were initially like transparent TIFF files in a massive sequence that you overlaid.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it was a nightmare. It was all DOS level command prompts. It was not great. But yeah, that's a really interesting topic. It might actually be quite fun one day to actually produce a 90s DF.
Oh my gosh. Well, I would love to try and do it, because sometimes I look at, I watch a lot of Lazy Game Reviews, LGR, and he's had a lot of oddware there, and some of it actually has to do with seeing other images from other PCs on your PC and things like that. And I think it's totally possible. I love it when people try and use retro hardware to produce modern videos, and I think it could be amazing.
Yeah, you'd also have to ask developers to role play their 90s selves.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah, interesting question though, nonetheless. And that is the final question of the show, and therefore the end of this particular edition of DF Direct Weekly. Like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content. Ring the bell for whatever pop-ups may or may not happen on your phone. I am subscribed to DF Clips, but I haven't rung the bell, but I just get all the notifications. No random gaming in HD recently, which is a bit disappointing. Gonna have to chase out that content myself. This is all going off on a major tangent. Yes, store.digitalfoundry.net for our various merchandising wares, including all of that new stuff I talked about what feels like 2 years ago now. But that's all from us for now. As always, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.